Hello and welcome to the WWF Conservation Insider Series, bringing you closer to the work that your support of WWF makes possible. My name is Will Garchor. I'm the Deputy Director for Legislative Affairs here at WWF, working with the U.S. government to advance our key policy priorities. And I'm honored to be moderating today's discussion. To start, I want to thank you all for your support, for your generous commitment to our work. Together, we are truly working to create a brighter future for wildlife, people, and the planet. And like you, I am excited to be here today to talk with some of our key experts in WWF's work to secure a future for threatened species by creating the Coalition to End Wildlife Trafficking Online. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Crawford Allen, Senior Director, Wildlife Crime and Traffic, and Giovanna Grein, Program Officer for Wildlife Crime and Traffic. Welcome to you both.
Well, thank you, Will. It's a great pleasure to be here and be part of the Conservation Insider series.
Thanks for having us, Will.
Yep. Well, today we're here to talk about the Coalition to End Wildlife Trafficking Online that WWF launched with partners this past March. The coalition, which is made up of 23 companies from around the world, including such online giants as Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Alibaba, eBay, and Tencent, is a first of its kind, uniting the tech sector towards the goal of ending wildlife trafficking online. I believe our audience is pretty aware by now of the threat that illegal wildlife trade poses to populations of many species. Currently, 20,000 African elephants are poached for their ivory every year, and every day an average of 3 rhinos are killed in South Africa for their horns. But when we think about wildlife trafficking, we often think of it in visceral terms, not necessarily in virtual terms. It's hard to imagine that these species can be added to your online shopping cart the same way you might add a new pair of shoes. So can you elaborate on how this trade is happening on the internet?
Yeah, sure. So Will, thanks. I just want to explain to people that it's very, very challenging out there. This is talking about the open web. What is there out in the open web, open to anybody? And it's surprising to people that our cyber investigators, literally with a click of a mouse, within a matter of minutes, can find endangered species online on some of those sorts of platforms everyone is so familiar with using. People know that wildlife is trafficked across the globe, but they think of it as shady back alleys with the criminal underworld. But actually it's there out in the open, in plain sight, but disguised as legal trade quite often. Any criminal with a cell phone connected to the internet has got a global market at their fingertips. They can reach out and sell products like this rhino horn medicine, which is from ground-up rhino horn that's sold in traditional medicine, particularly in Asia. There's a whole range of species that they can sell online, such as the marine species of turtle, such as this sea turtle called a hawksbill turtle, which are used in taxidermy specimens and spectacles. Even tigers are used in medicine, and their skins, their bones and other parts are traded online, and live tiger cubs too. You see, the online marketplaces that sell things like these ivory carvings are less risky than the physical marketplace, where they can be located and literally physically arrested and apprehended. And in this case, it's a case of anonymity hiding them. They can be operating anywhere in the world, and they can appear to be operating anywhere in the world. So about eBay. Everyone's aware of Facebook. Most people use Facebook. But these are not just used by people like you and me. They're used by wildlife criminals too. That piece of ivory, I've got a piece here, it looks like this could be a real antique, but actually the reality is these pieces are sold online all the time, and we've watched and we've tracked them. We found that they've come from elephants that were poached just weeks or months earlier, and they make these to look like they're a real antique, when it's from a poached animal. And the trail of that blood goes all the way back to Africa from the marketplace. It's pretty tough stuff, but that's where we come in, where we take this on. We take this on straight and look it in the eye, and we deal with it, and we help the companies. We help the companies understand what products there are online that are illegal, what's not. We don't want to try and ban everything. We want to understand how these criminals are operating and abusing these networks, abusing these online platforms. It can be quite challenging, and we've had some recent challenges we've been overcoming, and luckily we've got Gia here who can tell us a bit more about some of the challenges that we've been overcoming.
Yeah, I think this increase from traditional e-commerce platforms into social media platforms is one of the biggest challenges we're facing right now. And as our audience knows out there, social media is everywhere and it's very powerful. And what sellers will do is use these platforms to kind of display the wildlife and the wildlife products that they have available, such as those seen on your screen here. And once they're able to find a buyer, they then take these conversations off the platform and into private messaging groups, which makes it much more difficult for us to track and to monitor, and for law enforcement as well. So for us, what we really want to work on is enhancing automated detection so that these ads aren't posted in the first place, but also working with, in addition to the social media companies, these private messaging apps so that we can really connect the dots across platforms.
Cool. So I'm thinking about the number of websites and apps that I might use on any given day, and of course that's just a drop in the bucket compared to what's out there. So with so many online avenues available for criminals to exploit, what does a successful approach look like? And how can this new coalition help to stop an aspect of the illegal wildlife trade that seems so hard to contain? And how did WWF get the idea for it in the first place?
Yeah, so I'll take that. I mean, it kind of started probably over a dozen years ago, and you'll see an image on the screen shortly about one of the first cases that I ever came across in online trafficking regarding a critically endangered species called a plowshare tortoise, found only in Madagascar, only a few hundred of these amazing animals left alive. And I found it being sold on an Indonesian website that sells exotic rare pets. And I noticed these strange notches on the shell, these two lines either side of the head there on the shell, and I recognized those as being identifiers by the conservation breeding facility in Madagascar that was re-releasing bred animals into the wild. I contacted them and they told me that this animal was Notch, the very same animal that was being sold, had been released into the wild as part of a repopulation program just 3 months earlier.
Wow.
And in that time, somebody had gone out, probably with intelligence through corrupt officials, had detected the animals, had collected them and smuggled them across the globe to Indonesia, where it was then being traded and marketed into markets like the US,
wow,
like Japan, like China. So this is what really started it for me, is how do we deal with this? Law enforcement, we informed law enforcement in Indonesia, nothing happened. We got in contact with the companies who could have taken those ads down, could have told us who it was, but they didn't. And I realized that actually a lot of the issue here was that these companies have a major role to play. They have an opportunity here to identify the problem, prevent it even from happening by not even allowing the ads to be posted. That's kind of where the idea came from. And then we realized that even if you did take this down from one site, they just build another persona and they start selling on another site. So we had to get as many sites together as possible with the same mindset to work together. Back in 2012, I met an amazing person called Winnie Lam from Google. If Winnie, she's a national council member of WWF. Winnie, if you're there, hi, thanks for your help. And we talked about this, and we started looking at what Google could do, and we realized soon enough that Winnie also had a lot of connections with many of the other companies. We also found those other companies had the same problem. That's where the idea of a global coalition came together. And we realized that with this insight from them, we could stop this altogether. We were seeing it start to grow, gradually at first, this illegal trade online. And eventually, through years of working together, we hosted the first sort of kickoff of the coalition in 2016, an informal group of companies, a small handful at first. And then I'll let Gia take the story from there.
Sure. So from there, we really worked with companies behind the scenes through closed door meetings to start to build up trust with us as WWF and also help them better understand the issue of illegal wildlife trade and the risk it posed to their own organizations, and then really let them know what they could do to stop it. And we know that all of these companies involved, there's a lot of competition, but fortunately we found that wildlife is a non-competitive issue amongst these companies. And we found some great champions within each organization, just like Winnie Lam, that have really helped take this work forward. So on March 7th, we officially launched our coalition to end wildlife trafficking online, which now includes 23 global companies, which you can see on your screen here. And we've set the bold goal through this coalition of reducing wildlife trafficking online by 80% by 2020. And given the companies on board, these cover the majority of the internet, so we're well on our way.
Wow, so that does seem like an ambitious goal with an even more ambitious timeline, less than 2 years away. So how are we working with this set of companies to ensure that they can meet that goal?
Yeah, so we're working with each company in this coalition to develop an action plan that's unique to their specific platform. And these action plans all incorporate the 5 main elements of our strategic approach. The first is ensuring that companies all have a really strong wildlife policy in place and ensuring that their staff are trained so that they can detect wildlife products and enforce that policy. working to educate their users so they can be a part of the solution instead of the problem, and then really collaborating with other companies, with our organizations, to share learning best practices, such as in like the AI space. One example we love to talk about is our work with our WWF Cyber Spotters, where we have trained supporters to identify illegal wildlife products online and then report them directly to us. And these range from college students to our more seasoned spotters who maybe don't know a computer as well or how to work it, but they really want to get involved. And we've had data sent in during lunch breaks, in between homework sessions. We had one spotter who was planning her wedding and sent in some illegal ads right up until she was walking down the aisle. So in 3 trials, our spotters have sent in 2,000 illegal posts that companies have taken down in response. And this process is very similar to what you're seeing on screen now, where they would take the time to look through each ad and look for some of those clues we've trained them in to identify. Another area is working with training company staff. So we worked with eBay's service center out in Salt Lake City to train their staff in how to detect illegal wildlife products, which was kind of a first for their team. And we met some really great people while we were there. Tyler was someone who was very memorable. We had pulled some live ads off the platform that we wanted to use as examples for the training. And he was in the back of the room taking these ads down before we were able to pull them up for the next session, which was actually really great to see. And Nancy, who would take the time to call up every single user and explain to them why a product was being removed. So you'll see here on the screen, on the left are some pangolin scales, and on the right, pangolin leather boots. And these leather boots are available. You can see them quite often online. And Nancy would call up a user and say, this is from an endangered species. You may have never heard of it before, but this is what it is. And there's really that passion there and that interest in educating so that the problem doesn't propel forward. And eBay has been a great example in this work. They've been working to combat wildlife trafficking online for better part of a decade, and in 2017 removed 45,000 listings that violated their wildlife policies.
Wow, well, that's an impressive number.
Yes.
So it's great to hear how leading companies really are stepping up on this issue, and to hear how individuals are really engaging passionately in helping the cause. So what hope do you have for the future of these efforts, and how do you take the success that a company like eBay has demonstrated and make sure that that becomes sort of standard practice across all the various platforms that we're working with?
Yeah, I have a lot of hope in this CyberSpotter work because we're taking the technology and these platforms that maybe are part of the problem and flipping that around to be part of the solution. And really just educating and engaging more and more users so that they not only learn what they shouldn't trade, but then they're empowered themselves to help us report it and kind of roll out a citizen watchdog program, if you will. And also, too, from the company side, we're really seeing that the companies get it. This isn't just a conservation issue or a feel-good issue. They really care about this issue, and they see that it's a threat to their business model. They know wildlife trafficking is linked to organized crime and other illicit activities, and they don't want any part of it.
Right.
So we have, our coalition companies are really leading the way, and they're bringing others along with them.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, it's been great. We've also been fortunate that we've got the Panda brand. It's a brand that's recognized, and anybody can check out WWF and see we've got the reputation, and they trust us to work with us. And we do work on the inside with some quite sensitive information. Everybody wants to know what these companies are doing. They're really in the spotlight, and they're really under pressure. I think that they've trusted us and taken us to work with them hand in hand to find these solutions. And not just that, that has caused a catalytic role where we can show some of the biggest companies in the world working with us and trusting us. That brings other companies on board. So we've got companies in China, in Africa, in Europe, all coming now together with us. We've got our staff and our offices working with those companies as well, local people, local communities involved, user base there, building up their own cyber spotters, we hope, in the future as well. And we think that we've gotten these companies lined up in a way that they can help us with what we see as an impending explosion of illegal trade online. As more and more users come online, as the world's resources get more finite, these species are more in demand. We think we're at that tipping point now, and if we don't actually stop it now, it might just be that genie that comes out the bottle we can't put back in. The trade will become too big and too problematic. So we're doing a situation here where we feel we're getting ahead of it, ahead of the problem before it gets too big, too difficult to do. But we need support, we need help. We need to keep on top of those latest trends. We need to help keep companies and our partners up to date. So we're looking now at doing things like predictive modeling. What is the future of the trends in the illegal wildlife trade? Well, the next big thing that's going to come along, it's rhino horn today, what's it going to be tomorrow? And so we're developing these predictive tools, but a lot of other things too. So if you watch this space, there's a lot of things we can't really talk about quite yet, but we've got some big partners that are going to come on board and join us. And we've got some of our existing partners going to make some big announcements. And I think people might just go, wow, WWF really is making a difference here. There is a change coming. But we know that with so many incredible species at stake, we know that cybercrime is becoming the new battleground, if you like, for wildlife crime. But fortunately, we've got the partners and the tools, we think, to really stop that in its tracks. And actually, it's going to be like a preemptive strike, if you like, against the criminal networks. We've got to keep one step ahead of the game, and our partners are going to help us do that.
Aside from supporting WWF financially, which we're always glad that you do, what else can individuals do to support WWF's effort to stop online wildlife trafficking?
Sure, so I'll take this one. So we welcome you all to join us through this Cyber Spotter program, where you'll get trained to identify illegal wildlife products and help us report those direct to companies. To demonstrate how this works, we have an image here on the screen. So elephant ivory has a really unique characteristic known as Schwager lines, and these are kind of those cross-hatching angles that you can see on the left-hand image. And often when you're looking at a piece of ivory, if you look at the bottom of an image, if there's a cross-section, or also on the rounded edges, you're able to spot these different lines. And if you see these, you know right away that it's either elephant ivory or mammoth, and you're going to want to go ahead and flag it. So if you're interested in becoming a cyber spotter, go ahead and reach out to the calls@wwfus.org for more information.
Great. So our next question is from Linda in Colorado. I recently heard mention of an illegal wildlife trade conference in London. Was WWF involved, and what was the conference's significance?
I'm just back from the London conference on illegal wildlife trade, obviously hosted by the UK government, and more interestingly by the royal family, with Prince William and Harry there promoting their passionate work that they're also doing on stopping illegal wildlife trade. It was a major international conference that really was a culmination of years of work that showed, thankfully, a lot of successes and a lot of responses and results. We were there as WWF and partners to showcase a lot of the work we were doing, to build new partnerships and to understand and learn what we can do next. What's the next new thing? For those of you in the US, it was really interesting to see a very high-level participation from the US government. The Attorney General,
right.
Jeff Sessions, was there. He gave a really effective speech that talked about what they have done and what they're going to do, and again announcing another $90 million to stop wildlife trafficking, which is fantastic. 3 years in a row that's been happening. And Will, I know you've had a little bit of a role in that and pushing Congress to appropriate those funds. So
well, the nice thing is that this is an issue, as we've seen over the last several years, has really gained steam with the U.S. government, both in the administration, even this from the previous one to this one, and then with Congress as well. So yeah, as you said, it was really impressive to hear the Attorney General's remarks. So.
And one theme that came out was obviously not just really strong law enforcement, obviously his Department of Justice, but also there's a lot of emphasis now on how we help communities. How do we bring communities along? It's not just the stick, it's how we get that carrot. How do we get people to understand about the value of nature, how they can become part of supporting efforts to conserve nature, but also make their own livelihoods,
right.
and keep things going,
right.
on a sustainable basis. And that was a very strong message. There were many community voices that were heard there, that were brought into the conference, and that was great to see. But it was overall, there was a lot of strong commitments made. There were many things are going to be achieved, I think, in the future. But it's something that I wouldn't want to do too many times. But I think if maybe the US would want to host one in a couple of years from now.
Our next question is from Susan in New York. Is there anything WWF or other organizations or entities can do to stop wildlife trade from moving to the dark web? And maybe you should just explain what the dark web is.
Okay, so for those of you who aren't criminals, hopefully that's all of you, the dark web is a special place on the internet that you can only reach through certain software and certain sites where a lot of illegal activity goes on, where people trade in drugs and other things on illicit product websites. And The dark web at the moment, we've done research with some of an intelligence consultancy, and they actually didn't find much wildlife on the dark web as it was already because there's no need. It's out there in the open. It's on the open web, which we all access day to day, and it's found through closed groups on Facebook, or it's found on e-commerce sites like eBay. So it's not something that is on the dark web, but actually what we want to achieve, people don't understand this. They think it's a bit strange, but we want the illegal wildlife trade to go onto the dark web.
Right.
We don't want it on the open web. The open web is a massive marketplace where criminals can charge very high prices. Once it's on the dark web, it's in the realm of a smaller group of criminals who understand what they're doing, and they won't be able to make such profit. And then it's obviously all very clearly illegal, and law enforcement can tackle it there and take them down through the dark web.
Well, and you don't end up with people inadvertently buying illegal products because they're not getting onto the dark web. Right?
I don't want my mom buying something on eBay by accident.
Right, when she goes on Facebook to post her pictures of her grandkids. Right? So next question is from Jeff in Wisconsin. Have you partnered with any companies to use technologies like AI, artificial intelligence, to detect illegal wildlife products?
Good question.
Yeah.
Do you want to take a hit?
Sure, I can start. So we actually just hosted a workshop last month, it's last month now, where we brought together our coalition company partners as well as the academic community to start to talk about, how do we better enhance these automated solutions? Since there's so many individual academic institutions and companies working on these, how do we bring everyone together? And I think a really important part of this is looking at image recognition. Especially a lot of sellers are now starting to remove some of the text from their listings because they know that companies are watching. They know that they know what keywords to look for and what clues that they're trying to work around. So image use is really heavy.
All the keywords to look for.
That's true. We've given them all the keywords.
You've given that list of hundreds of keywords so that they can adapt their filters and they can take things down.
Yes.
But if there's no words, then they can't take it down for the keyword search.
Right.
So now we're moving beyond that search word phase, now that we've kind of gotten a hold on that and starting to look more in image recognition with companies.
Yeah, no, it's an exciting kind of frontier, right? This whole artificial intelligence world.
Yes.
Our next question is from Mark in Washington. How does WWF's work with this coalition fit in with WWF's broader efforts to end the illegal wildlife trade, which are many, so we should talk a little bit about those.
Yeah, I think we could all talk about various things because WWF is doing so much on stopping illegal wildlife trade. I think, we take a whole of trade chain approach to illegal wildlife trade, if you like, from WWF, from starting with the so-called boots on the ground, the strong enforcement, the site level protection, making sure these animals are not killed in the first place, stopping the linkages through. So that's investing in on the ground kind of training, resources, tools, technology, so using automated video systems that will detect the heat signature using thermal imaging cameras of a poacher moving through a park. That's having great success. Some of the work that WWF's been doing in certain sites in Africa have already within a few months caught over 200 poachers through using donated actually thermal imaging cameras from FLIR, one of WWF's partners. It's been a really great initiative on working with tech companies in a different way. Not online, not on the cyber front line, but actually on the ground, using things that can help rangers patrol and also keep them alive, which is a critical thing. There's a whole host of things along the trade chain that we're working on too. But Will, maybe you've got a lot of experience on this too recently in Congress. What have we been doing there?
Sure. I mean, I think in addition to as you say, our work on the ground to stop poaching and also to help countries create value from their wildlife resources, right? As you said, the carrot side of it as well, that like our work in Namibia, where we've worked with communities to build rural benefits from the presence of wildlife so that you want to protect them rather than poach them, which has been a huge success and is now a model for the world. Working with the U.S. government to get them to show leadership abroad, right? I think our Stop Wildlife Crime campaign back in 2012 that we launched, really we were at the forefront of those efforts, and now there's a whole coalition of groups and NGOs working on this issue. But you've really seen the U.S. government not only step up with the funding, which has increased steadily and now is like a nice robust chunk of money that has huge support behind it, but showing their leadership on the world stage in implementing their domestic ivory regs to tighten up the ivory market here, which helped trigger action in China. So there's a whole series of angles that we come at this from, and we've got a great team working on it here at WWF. So.
Well, I think too there'll be some great features on this in this upcoming version of the WF
That's right.
magazine. So
That's
stay
right.
tuned.
The nice elephant feature, right?
Yeah, and the work's going things like elephants in Myanmar and protecting them and stopping the trafficking in Myanmar, which has become a really big market.
Yeah, emerging
a lot
issue.
of leakage across the borders into countries like China as well.
Right, right, yeah. So lots going on this front for sure. And I think the online stuff obviously is a key component of all of that too, right?
More and more.
So our next question is from Barry and Mary in Maryland. Wow, that's a lot of rhyming going on there. Is anything being done to detect bad players across platforms and refer them to enforcement officials? So how do we fit into that piece of that puzzle?
Do you want to start on that one?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So when it comes to law enforcement, obviously for decades we've been finding illegal things going on, be it in the marketplace, all over the world, and we report them to the relevant local law enforcement officials. We also have connections to, say, Interpol and those kind of guys where we provide, we actually have ex-law enforcement people we've hired in some places around the world, like in Africa, who do analysis of information and provide that to law enforcement for them to take targeted action against what we basically identify the kingpins and get them to do their enforcement. So, but with the companies, it's a very different situation, and we have to work very carefully with them. At the moment, a lot of the information that law enforcement gets from these companies is actually under subpoena to those companies, where they have to give them. But these companies, I think people need to understand, we're not making excuses for them, but they're dealing with a whole load of problems in the world. They're dealing with Russian trolls, they're dealing with all sorts of child exploitation and drug trafficking and all sorts of things on their sites. And they've got a list of priorities. And wildlife has gotten onto the list of the priorities, but it's at the bottom of the priorities right now. We don't necessarily think it needs to move up too high up that list. There are so many important global issues they're dealing with. But they have to obviously have a certain number of resources and a certain ability to share information with law enforcement. We're encouraging them to work more and more together. We actually one of our partners we work with is called I4, and we, with them, went to a meeting at Interpol headquarters with 6 of our partner companies, and we sat down for a few days in Lyon, France. Very nice it was too. And we discussed how is it these companies can come together to, in a sensible, reasonable way, provide the most useful information. If you think eBay at any one point in time has 1 billion ads, right now there are 1 billion ads on eBay around the world. How do you sift that out and give that to law enforcement? Law enforcement can't handle the data. eBay has to work out ways to sift it down to the nuggets of what is the most critical information, but they're not law enforcement.
Right.
So they need to work that out. And we've made some great progress and strides forward between bringing them together, and they're figuring it out right now, but we're not there yet. That's the next thing.
Right. And we all have our roles to play in this, right?
Yeah.
Our next question is from Audrey, who is a cyber spotter. Are platforms considering creating a training video or some other notification so everyday users are aware of the issues surrounding illegal wildlife products online?
I'll take that one. Yes. Hi, Audrey. I'm glad you're tuning in. Absolutely. That's one thing we're really looking to ramp up within the coalition is the user education piece. And that's for each company so they can, have a training demo. This is exactly where you go to report a product on our platform and really encourage that reporting. And also just making it really clear and explicit what those policies are and easier to enforce. And also just kind of rolling out user messaging. This past World Elephant Day on August 12th, WF, we put out kind of a quiz to see if you can detect those elephant Schrager lines that companies were then sharing out as well to kind of just keep that awareness rolling.
The Schrager lines are interesting. It's like, I know that there's issues around, for example, mammoth versus elephant. That's where it gets kind of tricky, right?
It does,
but,
yes.
Yeah.
But I can say I've been monitoring, 4 or 5 years now looking at this stuff. And probably at least 90% of what I find is elephant ivory.
Yeah.
And you can usually get close enough. The difference is the size of the angles. So for elephant ivory, it's going to be greater than 115 degrees. And for mammoth, it'll be less than 90. So we kind of know to look for that. But I think as a good rule of thumb, just go ahead and flag it all.
Our next question is from Patrick. Where do governments fit into this effort? Okay, China, Japan, Indonesia. Will these countries put laws in place to protect nature? So we talked a little bit about China tightening up their ivory laws. You might want to talk about that. But what are some other governments doing alongside the U.S.?
Yeah, I think a lot of the consumer markets, people think of it as the main trade going to Asian markets of ivory and rhino horn and that kind of thing. And it's true. That is where a lot of that trade is happening because of the rise of wealth there and because of the desire to consume, obtain, purchase, own the rarest of the rare, which is a real sort of social status issue in many countries,
Right.
is the reason for this is going there. And so it's a good question about what are the governments there doing. This shouldn't just be a US push, US government investment or politics on that. And we are seeing actually a great response from many governments in Asia. Not all. There are still some bad actors out there, and they still need to clean up their act. But not all of them are perfect either. And one example is China, where China is a curious beast in that it's taken really strong measures now to try to tackle the ivory problem. It's recognized that it is the driving force behind the poaching of elephants in Africa and the demise that we've seen of the elephants. They've banned ivory trade now in that country since the end of last year. We're hopeful and we're seeing signs that there is a decreasing demand, that prices are dropping. There is far less ivory trade in the market in China, and hopefully that will then have a ripple effect back to Africa ultimately that protects elephants more and more. Some countries are not doing as much. They're a lot more complacent and actually deceptive. I mean, the government of Laos, for example, which is hosting a major trafficking hub of illegal wildlife in the world and protecting some of the most serious organized crime kingpins in the world within its borders. They've got a lot to do, and they need to work harder at that.
Yeah.
And the question that comes to mind is corruption. How do we beat corruption? Luckily, WWF has just secured a major investment from the US government to take on board exactly that issue.
Right.
How do we figure out over the next 5 years we can put a stop to the corruption in the natural resource sector, protect wildlife, forests, and marine species?
Right. Yeah, and as you sort of hint at there, it goes beyond just, say, elephants or pangolins, but there's huge illegal trade in timber and fish globally as well, and all of it tied in with a lot of other transnational organized crime. So it's exciting that we're going to get to dive in on that work with some key partners. And our next question is from James in Indiana. Do WWF, National Wildlife Federation, and African Wildlife Foundation work together to tackle this issue and others? So WWF, NWF, and AWF, how are we working together?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things I know of. You know a few yourself. One of the things we're doing is we're working on sniffer dogs, for example, in Africa with the African Wildlife Federation that's going on right now in ports in East Africa, where we're bringing together sniffer dog teams trained to detect ivory and pangolin and rhino horn to seaports and airports to detect the scent of those hidden and secreted goods within air freight, sea freight, that kind of thing, and baggage. The twist on the tail, if you like, of this is that it's not just the dog.
Yeah.
Right? The dogs, they get exhausted in the heat. They have the risk of things falling on them. They can even get poisoned by corrupt officials, like if they're really good drug dogs, for example, at those ports. And so what we've figured out is there is a way to protect the dogs, expedite the rate of detection by having the dog sitting comfortably eating kibble in an air-conditioned trailer off-site, but then have a vacuum system, a technology system that extracts the air from a sea container, for example, puts it through a filter, condenses the essence of the scents within that sea container. You then take those containers to the dog sitting happily, who can only usually go through one sea container a day, probably. Right. They can take 20 sea containers a day. They can check them out, and they can detect whether or not that contains ivory or rhino horn. And we've had some success with that. Again, working in partnership with a number of partners, WWF, Traffic, and AWF, all working together in, for example, this case, the port of Mombasa in Kenya.
Yeah, and I will say, like, NWF focused more in the U.S. domestically as an organization, the National Wildlife Foundation, and but we work with, I would say, 24 NGOs at various capacities on this very issue. Yeah. I mean, when we were working with the U.S. government on the national strategy to combat wildlife trafficking, when that was first coming together, WWF convened about 24 NGOs to put together recommendations for that strategy, including the groups that were mentioned. So we work very closely and on a weekly basis, especially in our government engagement work. Mm-hmm. So our next question is from Judith in California. What countries are the worst offenders in terms of failure to counteract poaching? We're going to name some names.
Well, that's a tough one, because I think, there's no government or country out there that wants to lose wildlife to poaching, right? Because wildlife is so important for society, for tourist revenues and incomes and so on. So nobody's really not doing, they probably can always do more, but it's a resource issue and it's a corruption issue. So it really depends on which countries have got the lowest capacity, the lowest resourcing and the most corruption, where the problems lie.
Right.
And where they've also got a geography and a landscape that makes it incredibly difficult to enforce. So if you're in Central African forests, those dense forests, it's just so difficult to go and detect. And the carcasses just melt into the forest, whereas in savanna elephants, you can, for example, you can see them from aerial surveying and that kind of thing, and you can follow the trail. So in some countries, it's very, very difficult for them to stop the poaching. Some countries are war-torn or dealing with strife and rebellion, and they're struggling too. There are some countries that are doing a great job. I mean, you mentioned Namibia. They're really sort of coming back and doing the best they can. South Africa is an interesting one because, they've probably thrown more resources and into anti-poaching than anyone else. Obviously, it's a big country with big problems, and it is the epicenter of poaching of rhinos, with obviously 1,200 rhinos poached at the peak in 1 year, which is pretty substantial. Yet the problem, as I see it, is not necessarily one of the ones we talked about. It's actually the fact that there is corruption, and the value of rhino horn being so high has meant that anybody is pretty much corruptible, and in previous administrations that money was flowing up to the top. So some of the challenges aren't necessarily with the government, but they're with individuals who are corrupt. So it's a different issue. And some countries are doing great stuff. Botswana seems to have been doing some good things, although there is more uncertainty now, some recent developments. But there's champions, and there are those that are struggling under adversity of the nature of the way their country is.
Yeah. I know that under the End Wildlife Trafficking Act, which Congress passed about 2 years ago, part of that was to identify countries where the most resources were needed, not necessarily the problem countries, but where the issue was the most striking. But then they also called out certain countries that they felt were being bad actors. And you hinted at, DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, but again, you have a huge country with a barely functional government, right? And so it's hard to know exactly how much control they can exert. But places where there's a lot more work needed, Madagascar, and I think Laos was the other, which we've already referenced. So, so our next question is from Catherine. I inherited a few pieces of antique ivory which my uncle bought in India in World War II. Should I donate it to a museum? What should I do with it?
Do you want to take a stab at that one?
Sure, happy to. So great question. So, well, it's not illegal to own it, right? The concern that we have here, particularly looking at online, is if you're trading it. But of course, we use a lot of donated wildlife products here for educational purposes, as far as training company staff and our cyber spotters. So they definitely get put to good use when donated to a proper organization. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think as you hint at, possession at this point, it's more about, are you driving trade further, and so if you have it at this point and you're not doing anything with it, then it's not that you're doing any harm, as long as you aren't going out and trying to sell it on the dark web, right?
So. Yeah.
We'll keep eyes out for it.
Okay. There's always Fish and Wildlife Service will take it. And,
Our next question is from Claire in Massachusetts. With organized crime being heavily involved in this issue, have you ever felt personally at risk doing the work you do? That's interesting. Yeah. I mean,
I think there is an enormous amount of risk in this, and I think there are many brave people out there that, even within the conservation world, obviously governments aside, it's a different issue, but, there's a lot of people, and unfortunately, there have been conservationists murdered because of their work to protect nature. And Wayne Lotter of the PANS Foundation, for example, who was murdered, assassinated, in fact, by 2 hitmen because he got too close to corrupt officials in Tanzania when he was really helping break open the organized crime rings that were involved in the massacre of so many thousands of elephants in southern Tanzania. Personally, I've had some experiences before. I used to work a lot on running our investigations around the world. I've been in some hairy situations in some places. I've been chased by people. I've been, hit with a few times and all sorts of things. And we've had threats and other stuff. But fortunately, nothing for me personally, but I know of people that we've worked with have had some very serious threats to them. Things have happened to them. And that's what is a risk that people take on board when they do this. And it's part of their love and their passion for nature, that they will take that risk on. I've been in Africa and I've been out on patrol in the middle of the night with rangers
Yep.
who've got, they're walking in the dark with no vision around them. You've mambas, you've got lions, and you've got heavily armed poachers, and the guys are scared.
Yep.
And the only time I saw them when they weren't scared was when we gave them basically the equipment to be able to see in the dark.
Right.
With those thermal imaging cameras, and it was like a revelation to them. They could feel a great deal more confidence. And those are the guys I admire the most, going out night after night, all night, or going sometimes into the bush for a week at a time, covertly waiting for poachers who are so brave. And our people are too. And we've got people around the world in WWF that I'm such a fan of, who are helping those rangers, who are going out with them night after night too to help them.
Yeah, no, I think it's an important, other piece of this story. The other tragedy is the number of rangers that have lost their life, patrolling parks in Africa and elsewhere. Oftentimes, without arms, they're doing it, without their weapons and without the guarantee that their families are going to be taken care of if something happens to them. So it's a really incredible story, the guys who are doing this. So I think that's probably a good place to wrap things up. Our sort of heroes in the field alongside our heroes online. On behalf of WWF, thank you for joining us and for supporting our efforts to protect the future of nature and all living things. And thanks to you both for a very stimulating conversation.
Thank you, Will.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a good night.
Thank you. Good night.